I wish this, before I start, I wish we didn't, this is going to sound weird, just stay with me. I wish we didn't know so much about Jesus and that we could discover him today for the very first time. Because sometimes in our culture 2,000 years later, we kind of have watered down the radical grace and the radical love of Jesus as he walked the streets of first century Palestine. I grew up in church, and I'm grateful I did, but, Jesus looked like a cool surfer, and he blessed people, and it was, kind of neat. But he was so much more than that, and he was so much more an enemy to the religious elite of that day. So I just pray that you would see not only his radicalness, the one that we follow and serve, but you would also see his amazing, amazing love that reaches to no ends to meet people right where they're at. All right? Okay, now I will start. Mike's back there with the notes going, where is he going with all of this? Barbara Coloroso, author, she says, there is something profoundly satisfying about sharing a meal. Eating together, breaking bread together is one of the oldest and most fundamentally unifying of human experiences. I grew up in the 1970s on the mean streets of Orangeville, California, on Pershing Avenue. I was part of a bike gang. And on Sunday afternoons, after church, my mom and dad would say to us 4 kids, invite anyone you want over, and we would have what came to be known as Taco Sundays. Come one, come all. It's a beautiful memory. Eat tacos all you want, they would say. Come one, come all. It would become very popular. And my sisters would invite their friends and potential boyfriends. I would have my friends come. Rob didn't have any friends, but he was there too. I always love, There were taco eating contests, ping pong contests, football in the background. It was a great memory. Great memory. Come one, come all. So I think what author Barbara Coloroso says is right. There's something profoundly satisfying about sharing a meal, eating together, breaking bread together, or even having tacos together. In the 1970s, according to the Harvard School of Education, 80% of families ate dinner together around a table. Today, around 30% eat together. So I'd like to repeat, there is something profoundly satisfying about sharing a meal, eating together, breaking bread together, or having tacos together. What's interesting when you go to World Relief, their storage place in East Sacramento, one of the biggest needs for families arriving from the East is they need dinner tables because they still practice much more than Westerners do, sitting around the table, finding out how everyone is doing, breaking bread together. The Gospels, the good news, are filled with stories and celebrations of Jesus sharing meals and breaking bread together with others. And the scandal that Jesus caused in these celebrations and the meal sharing in the first century Palestinian Judaism can scarcely be appreciated by the Christian world today, by the Western world today. The class system was deeply entrenched. It was legally forbidden to mingle with, I'm going to do this a lot, sinners. Sinners. Well, aren't we all sinners? Haven't we all fallen short? But the religious elite had decided who were sinners and who were not sinners. It was legally forbidden to mingle with sinners who were outside the law. There was a prohibition on sharing meals with beggars, prostitutes, and tax collectors. It was a religious, social, and cultural taboo. Theologian Marcus Borg notes that one of the most striking features of Jesus' ministry was the meals he shared with sinners, that is, outcasts. Pharisees and others would not eat with somebody who was impure, and no decent person would share a meal with an outcast. This was the system. Unfortunately, as I said, the meaning of meal sharing is largely lost on Western society today. In the East today, to share a meal with someone is a symbol of peace, trust, brotherhood, and forgiveness. The shared table is a shared life. To say to an Orthodox Jew, I would like to have dinner with you, is understood as I would like to enter into a friendship with you. I would like to enter into a relationship with you. Even today, when members of Orthodox Jewry extend a dinner invitation, they're saying, let me put it up here, come to my Mikdash Mahat. I didn't say that right, but that's the Hebrew word for come to my miniature sanctuary, my small holy place, my dining room table, and we will celebrate the most beautiful experience that life affords, relationship, friendship. That's what it meant in first century Palestine and what it means even today. See, that is what Zacchaeus, the chief tax collector, a sinner, heard when Jesus called him down from the sycamore tree. And that is why Jesus' practice of table fellowship, of dining together, caused hostile remarks from the outset of his ministry from the religious elite. Come to the table. That's all Jesus asks. That's what today is about, but that's why Jesus came. Come to the table. It did not escape the Pharisees' attention that Jesus intentionally invited to the table riffraffs and rabble. Do we have any riffraffs and rabble here today? You see, Jesus was not only breaking the law, he was destroying the very structure of the hierarchy of Jewish society. They all complained, it says, when they saw what was happening. He's gone to stay at a sinner's house. Albert Nolan, who wrote this beautiful book called Jesus Before Christianity. What was it like when Jesus walked the streets before he went to the cross? He says it would be impossible to overestimate the impact these meals must have had upon the poor and the sinners. By accepting them as friends and equals, Jesus has taken away their shame, humiliation, and guilt. By showing them that they mattered to him as people, he gave them a sense of dignity. The physical contact which he had with them at the table must have made them feel clean and acceptable. They were now acceptable to God. Their sinfulness, ignorance, and uncleanness had been overlooked and were no longer being held against them. Through meal sharing, through inviting people to a table to share a meal, Jesus ritually acted out and portrayed the Father's indiscriminate love, a love that gives his sunlight to both the evil and the good and sends rain on the just and on the unjust too. One of my heroes, Brennan Manning, said it like this. Jesus was often the host, and the guest list would include a ragtag parade of donkey peddlers, prostitutes, herdsmen, slumlords, and gamblers. A social climber, Jesus was not. Swiss theologian Hans Kung, and we'll get to him later too, but he wrote this. For Jesus, this fellowship at the table with those whom the devout had written off was not merely the expression of liberal tolerance and humanitarian sentiment. It was the expression of his mission and message, peace and reconciliation for all, without exception, even for the moral failures. All he said was, come to the table and let's dine together. Philip Yancey, in his book, What's So Amazing About Grace, writes about a pastor in the Colorado Hills who on Sunday afternoons would invite people who were unchurched and ex-churched to his home for a simple home-cooked meal. And around that table, there would be laughter, tears, no judging, acceptance, truth, confession, just unconditional love. And in this simple shared meal, over time, he said, many discovered or rediscovered the radical, scandalous grace of our Lord. Isn't that beautiful? Jesus said it like this, persuade the beggars on the streets, the outcasts, even the homeless. Insist that they come in, enjoy the feast so that my house will be full. What was Jesus saying right there? It's Taco Sunday, friends, and everyone is welcome. I'm not sure how you did it. It was like the miracle I'm about ready to talk about. The tacos never ran out. Because one of Scripture's most famous meal sharing with Jesus was not around a table, but on a hillside with over 10,000 people, desperate, marginalized, hungry, ostracized from the religious elite. It's a familiar story, but let me just share it quickly. Jesus and his disciples need some time together alone, so they get in a boat, sail across the Sea of Galilee. And what do the crowds do? They follow him. It says, when Jesus went to shore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them because they were sheep without a shepherd. Jesus had compassion because these people were sheep without a shepherd. What does sheep without a shepherd mean? What does that mean? Well, Exodus chapter 34, God explains through the prophet Ezekiel. Ezekiel 34, he explains through the prophet what Jesus was dealing with, why Jesus, the good shepherd, had compassion, and why these people were sheep without a shepherd. Let me just read it to you. God does not mince any words. He says this to the religious elite. Doomed to you, shepherds of Israel, feeding your own mouths. Aren't shepherds supposed to feed sheep? You drink the milk, you make clothes from the wool, you roast the lambs, but you don't feed the sheep. You don't build up the weak ones, don't heal the sick, don't doctor the injured, don't go after the strays, don't look for the lost. You bully and badger them. God, what are you really getting at here? And now they're scattered every which way because there's no shepherd. Scattered and easy pickings for wolves and coyotes. Scattered my sheep, exposed and vulnerable across mountains and hills. My sheep scattered all over the world, and no one is looking out for them. This was the spiritual condition of Israel in first century Palestine in Jesus' day. Where are the shepherds? Nowhere. And Jesus is moved with compassion. And the crowds keep following Jesus. These were the forgotten dregs of society because they were on the bottom of the hierarchy of power. The religious elite, the missing shepherds, viewed them as disposable and a drain on society. I want you to picture the people on this hillside. The great theologian Albert Schweitzer says, if you were to ask the leaders of Israel about these poor backwood hicks from Galilee, they might just quote Ebenezer Scrooge and say, if the poor are going to die, they'd better do it and decrease the surplus population. Be done with them. Wow. I don't want that kind of shepherd. But it says Jesus welcomed them and spoke to them. And what did he speak to them? He spoke about a different kingdom, and he healed those that needed healed. He just had compassion. This is Jesus. You know the story. The disciples see the people are hungry, so they tell Jesus, send the crowd away. They can go to the nearby villages and countryside. They can find food and a place to stay. There's nothing here. What they're saying, it's late in the day. There's no Chick-fil-A. There's nowhere to get food. I like that, Chick-fil-A. There's nothing we can do. It's over 10,000 people. The disciples, though, have forgotten. They've forgotten the words of Jesus who said, I am the bread of life. No one coming to me will ever go hungry again. Jesus says, you give them something to eat. And they say, we have no more than 5 loaves and 2 fish unless we go and buy food for these people. Even if we had the money to buy, who's going to cater for this size of a crowd? So Jesus, the bread of life, is a very beautiful miracle. He took the 5 loaves and 2 fish, and I want you to picture this. It's the first time I noticed this. He looked up to heaven, blessed them, the 5 loaves, 2 fish, broke them, and he kept giving them to the disciples to set before the crowd. I like that. He kept giving them. The disciples probably were handing out. They go back to Jesus. Well, he's got to be out by now. He just kept giving them. And after a while, they're like, it just never ends. It never ends. And then it says this, they all ate and were satisfied. Everybody say satisfied. 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 All they had been eating was bread and fish, yet they were satisfied. There was no salt and pepper. There was no butter for the bread, or Cholula for the fish, or a spritz of lime juice for their tilapia. But it says they were satisfied. Satisfied, that's a word that you might use after a Thanksgiving meal, after you've had 4 helpings of turkey with gravy and stuffing, sweet potatoes, bread and butter, pumpkin pie, and whipped cream, right? Satisfied. 4 helpings, and you have to unbutton your pants, and you recline your lazy boy chair, and as you fall into a tryptophan coma, I'm satisfied. With just some bread and fish, they're satisfied. I think they were satisfied physically, but they knew something supernatural was happening. And I think in their spirit, they were satisfied. I am the bread of life, Jesus says. No one coming to me will ever be hungry again. The psalmist cries out, my soul is satisfied as with a rich feast, and my mouth praises you with joyful lips. I think this is how the people were feeling. It wasn't just a free meal. They said, whoa, there's something else going on here. The despised, the forgotten, the judged, the shepherdless were fed by Jesus. This is a beautiful miracle. It's pointing us to the one who provides not only for our stomachs, but for satisfaction and provision for our souls. But wait, there's more. It goes on when it says, He took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke them and kept giving them to the disciples to set before the crowd. When you go further in the book of Luke to the Last Supper, it says this, very similar words from Jesus on the hillside. He took the bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." Take, thank, break, and give. The same exact 4 words in the exact same order in both of those passages. This is not an accident. This is on purpose by design. Luke is making a connection with this miracle on the hillside of feeding the 10,000, that Jesus is the Messiah whose body will be broken and given for the salvation of his people. That's why we're coming to the table today. So time out here. What does this mean for us this morning, besides what I just talked about? I think for a moment we just stop and look at the actions of Jesus, and it reminds me of our partnerships, World Relief, Orangeville Fair Oaks Food Bank, Powerhouse Ministries, growing past today and tomorrow and growing these kids up with dignity. Jesus is our example. He feasted with the despised and the forgotten and disposed of the judged and the judged of society. Our partnerships are showing God's unconditional love to the despised and forgotten and too often judged in our society. And Jesus, through his meal sharing ministry around tables and on desolate hillsides, is providing for you and I a model for kingdom ministry. We are to imitate our Savior and welcome and dine with and love and share the good news with the disenfranchised, the despised, the marginalized, the ostracized of our world. Jennifer Bartu, I interviewed her. She grew up in Kenya. She works for World Relief. Remember if you were here when I interviewed her? She was walking across the bridge from college to go home, and she saw people living under the bridge. She went down and introduced herself, and they were refugees. And she could see they were hungry, but she didn't just bring them food. She went and shared a meal with them, and it changed everything. That meal sharing created relationship. And I think it was easier for her to do that than us because we don't do that in our Western culture. We're good at handing out food, but sharing a meal with someone different than us. But in the East, it's like this is what we do. And those people below knew that when she came to share a meal that she wanted a relationship. That built a ministry in her church to welcome the refugees. Jesus gives us a model for ministry, and Jesus shows us the power of meal sharing. I've been thinking about this a lot this week. How is this going to look different in my life going forward? Shane Claiborne works in the inner cities of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. It's almost as rough as Orangeville, California. But anyway, we argue about that later. But it's a rough area. And they were serving food and sharing meals with the homeless in Love Park. And the city made an ordinance, you can't feed people in Love Park. But there was a loophole. You could have a religious service there. So every day they would gather. Shane would give a 10-minute message. And then they would do communion. A slice of pizza and a can of pop. Isn't that great? And they shared a meal together. They shared communion and a meal together. Mahatma Gandhi said, there are people in the world so hungry that God cannot appear to them except in the form of bread. And Jesus is the bread of life, friends. This is the one we worship, the one who said, come to the table. Jesus, the bread of life, broke barriers by eating bread with untouchables, and he broke spiritual barriers by offering himself the bread of life so people would never be hungry again. Now, Hans Kung, he's a German theologian. He's maybe written one of my favorite books. It's called On Being a Christian. And it's a portrait of the real Jesus as opposed to the made-up kind of Jesus. It has revolutionized my understanding of Christ and the meaning of Christian discipleship. And in passionate and beautifully written prose, he says this about the church. And I'm going to read this slow. I'm just going to read it slowly. Let it sink in. He says, the Church of Jesus Christ is a home, not only for the morally upright, but for the moral failures and for those who, for a variety of reasons, have not been welcomed into the traditional church. The church is a healing community proclaiming the Father's indiscriminate love and unconditional grace, offering pardon, reconciliation, and salvation to the downtrodden, and leaving the judgment to God. A church that will not accept the fact that it consists of sinful men and exists for sinful men becomes hard-hearted, self-righteous, inhuman. It deserves neither God's mercy nor men's trust. But if a church with a history of fidelity and infidelity, of knowledge and error, takes seriously the fact that it is only in God's kingdom that the wheat is separated from the tares, good fish from the bad, sheep from goats, a holiness will be acknowledged in it by grace which it cannot create for itself. If the church self-righteously remains aloof from failures and irreligious and immoral people, it cannot enter justified into God's kingdom. But if it is constantly aware of its guilt and sin, it can live in joyous awareness of forgiveness. The promise has been given to anyone who humbles himself will be exalted. Whew. Friends, this is what happens when we have an encounter with the radical love and unconditional love of Jesus Christ. Something happens. Something happens around the table that changes those that are given a seat. Now, there's others that will look from afar and judge who are sitting there, but those who come to the table, their lives are forever changed. And throughout Jesus' ministry, he invites a ragtag group of sinners to have a seat at the table. Let me remind you of Brennan Manning's words again. The guest list will include a ragtag parade of donkey peddlers, prostitutes, herdsmen, slumlords, and gamblers. There is just something about what happens at the table that shows us who Jesus is. From the table of Zacchaeus' house, where Jesus surprisingly hung out with a tax collector, to the table where Jesus' reputation was at risk while his feet got washed by a prostitute, to the table where he ate with his closest friends just before they abandoned him, each table was more about the food that they were eating. So let me give you three things real fast, because we're heading to the table now, because I want you to think about this while you take communion. Three things real fast. One, at the table, you are known. You are known. When Jesus shared the Passover meal with the disciples, Jesus wasn't oblivious to the kind of friends he had. He didn't find out later and go, well, I never should have shared that meal. He shared the meal knowing everything about them. He knew that one of them was going to betray him, another would pretend he didn't know him, and the rest, except one, would abandon him. And yet he shared a meal with him. You see his heart. These guys are still arguing about who's the greatest the night before the cross. Jesus knew everything about them, and that didn't change the fact that he loved them and invited them to have a seat at the table. So Jesus today says, come to the table. Jesus invites you to the table, knowing not only your past sins, but your future ones too. Jesus knows everything about you and invites you to the table. No amount of sin or failure or doubt or struggle will get your seat removed from the table. 2, at the table, you are forgiven. You're forgiven. This meal wasn't with the disciples, wasn't just about an annual tradition. It was more than just some friends hanging out. Jesus had a meal that initiated something even greater than they had previously experienced. During the meal, Jesus says, this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. It was more than just bread and wine. It was more than just remembrance. Jesus gave himself. And he still gives himself to anyone that will come to the table. Jesus isn't holding back some of himself for when you get your act together. He's given it all to you. He's saying, take, eat, trust. Your sins, all of them are forgiven. And 3, at the table, you get a taste of what's to come. You get a taste of what's to come. Jesus said around that table, for I tell you, I will not drink again from the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes. Jesus connects the Last Supper, his last meal around the table, to even a greater meal, the ultimate banquet. The meal they were eating became about a future meal. It's a feast that all who believe will celebrate. I read this about every couple of months. He talks about it in Isaiah 25. On this mountain, Yahweh will prepare for all nations a feast of the finest foods. Choice wines and the best meats will be served. Jesus is talking about the ultimate banquet. Imagine, just stop here for a second. Imagine the world we live in right now, and then imagine that banquet table. All nations. For all who believe, all nations, sitting across a banquet table. Jews and Palestinians, Syrians and Iraqis, Koreans, Chinese, Russians, Ukrainians, Iranians, Americans, Italian, Lebanese, Egyptians, Irish. Picture what this table is going to look like. English, Nigerians, Kenyans, Tanzanians, Rwandans, Indians, even the French will be there. Jacques, I know you're watching right now, so that was for you. Only Jesus can do this, friends, because it doesn't look like anybody else can do that if you look at our world. Friends, this banquet table will be filled with the rich, the poor, the powerful, and the powerless who've struggled and failed in a variety of ways, all brought together at this table. It will be a feast where you will be surprised who is there. And there will be a lot who are surprised you're there. We're all one, united, saved by the work of Christ. That's the promise of our faith, friends. That's our faith. And it will also be a feast with people we've longed to be reunited with and eat with again. Finally reunited because the power of the one who can raise the dead. As Isaiah continues about the banquet, all of us sitting around the table, Yahweh will swallow up death forever and wipe away every tear. Imagine that day, friends. At this feast, no one will be there because they deserve it. There are no hopes of paying back the cost of the meal, no tipping. It's already covered. It's the feast of all feasts, the party we have been waiting for. And so today, when you come to the table, Jesus reminds you and I of his desire to give us a seat at the table. He says to us what he said to the disciples. It has been my deep desire to eat this Passover meal with you. It is his deep desire to have this meal with you. He's been waiting to eat with you. He's been waiting for you to sit, to talk, to eat, relationship, friendship. He's been waiting to give himself to you. You may not have expected to be welcomed at his table, but you are. That's what Jesus does. Jesus invites broken people to the table and says, take, eat, it is for you.